John, you're here today to talk to us about the S-500 program and the result of it, and how it might perform in action. So I think I'll leave it over to you, John.
Yeah, so I think I'm gonna kind of rehash the thread that I wrote in a slightly different order. I think with some added detail that I didn't really stick in my thread that, with hindsight, I probably should have. So I try to I won't I'll try to avoid getting too bogged down in the minutia here, but I think it's helpful to start at the beginning, at the way beginning, which is S300 itself. Um, there is, I guess, a lot of confusion over what S300 is. I won't go into an incredible level of depth because Chung Su on Twitter, I linked his threads in my thread, has already done extremely excellent threads on the history of the development and procurement of those systems by the Soviets in a lot more detail than I really need to go into here. But just as a brief explainer here, S300 really refers to three different systems: S300P, S300F, and S300V. It was originally a joint Army, Navy, Air Force, so SV, the Army, VMF, the Navy, and VKS, the Air Force procurement program. In the Soviet days, they'd want to procure a long range SAM system between all of them using a common interceptor. That broke down primarily because the VKS and the VMF, their priority was on air breathing threats and aircraft. So, air breathing threat is something like cruise missiles, for example, AGM 86. That was the primary reference threat for S300P as it became known as it happened. So, that program split off into two: one for the Air Force and Navy, focusing on air breathing threats, and then one for the Army, focusing on tactical ballistic missile threats. They were very concerned with what was infielded by the United States Army, the Lance tactical ballistic missile, and the Pershing 1, initially short range ballistic missile. So that split the family off into two trees. There's S300P, which is the Air Force SAM, S300F, which is a navalized version of S300P, and then there's S300V for the Army. And these systems are all totally different. They have totally different vehicles and prime movers. They have totally different missiles, totally different sensors, totally different command vehicles. There's very little in common between them. And S500 is really an outgrowth of S300V. So there's a lot of Russian media tends to depict it as a successor, or I should say non-defense oriented Russian media, and this is filtered over to English media, has depicted it as a successor to S400, which it is not. So to sort of give some context there, S400 is just an iterative upgrade on S300P. It was originally called S300 PMU3. I just renamed to S400 for marketing reasons, really. What S500 is it's a derivative of S300V, but it's in VKS service, not SV service. So it's an Air Force service, not Ground Forces service. And what originally happened is there was a lot of very strange Russian procurement politics and conflicting requirements for the system. So I've spoken to Granger about this. He's on Twitter. He's one of the resident experts on sort of the Russian defense industrial base in the English language sphere. And the thing that he had pointed out to me when we were discussing it is that initially it seems like the VKS had wanted a long range SAM system optimized for ABTs, air breathing threats, to defend A135 and A235, which are the terminal ballistic missile defense systems that defend Moscow from ICBM class threats. They'd wanted a complementary system to that could again provide air breathing coverage, to defend those ABM assets from multi-domain attacks, essentially. However, at some point, that ABT requirement got combined with a requirement for mobile theater missile defense, ballistic missile defense against TBMs, tactical ballistic missiles. And what the VKS ended up doing is they took S300V, specifically, they took one of the missiles for S300V. If you could go ahead and germinate to Ukraine, if you could begin pulling up those images, that'd be very helpful, actually. If you could pull up the ones that have the diagrams of the missiles, please. This is not the order I sent them to you, but
Yeah, sure. Hold on a second.
second too.
Yeah, the second one, yeah. This one?
No, the second two, the two after it.
You said with the diagrams.
The missile diagram. The next two after that, sorry.
Okay. So this one.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
So S-300V has two missiles with it. There's 9M83 and there's 9M82. As you can tell, they're very similar. 9M82 just has a much larger booster than 9M83. And essentially, the whole idea was 9M83 was optimized against shorter range TBMs like Lance. 9M82 was optimized against longer range TBMs, Pershing 1 initially. And what the Russians did for S-500 is they created a new missile, new in air quotes, called 77N6N and 77N6N1. I'm not actually clear on what the distinction between those two is. But in any case, they derived two new missiles from 9M82M. I say M because they upgraded 9M82 as part of the S300 V4 upgrade package that they rolled out like a decade ago. And they basically made the booster longer. So if you could pull up the other image with the other three missiles on it, that was before this one.
This one.
Yes. So as you can see, this is not the best diagram because we don't have that many good open source images of 7.7 and 6N, but it's understood more or less they made the booster longer. And the reason why they did this, and this kind of gets to the crux of my thread, is for a couple reasons. The main one, really the relevant one, is that 9M82, its engagement, well, I should back up a little bit. So what the VCAS wanted to do is they wanted to increase S-500's defended footprint. So essentially the radius or area, depending on how you define it, of air that you can defend against TBMs. And there's various ways to do this. However, the Russians put themselves in a bit of a box because they selected 9M82 as the starting point for their engineering. And so the reason why that was problematic for them is because 9M82 only has aerodynamic control surfaces. So, and that's an issue because your effective defended footprint against TBMs is primarily, there's other factors, but primarily a function of the altitude at which you can engage the TBM. Because if you're engaging it at a greater distance, that also means you're engaging it at a greater altitude because of that ballistic trajectory. It's coming down towards you from apogee. Whereas if you want to engage an air breathing threat at longer range, you just directly increase the horizontal range of that engagement. And so one of the things that constrains the ability of traditional surface-to-air missiles to engage threats at high altitudes, usually TBMs, of course, is the fact they have aerodynamic control surfaces. And as I'm sure we're all aware, the atmosphere becomes less dense as your altitude increases. So missiles, for all else being constant, a missile with aerodynamic control surfaces only is going to be much more maneuverable at low altitudes where the atmosphere is relatively dense versus at high altitudes where it's relatively thin. And to kind of put this in context, the atmosphere at 50 kilometers, the atmospheric density at 50 kilometers above sea level is 0.01% of atmospheric density at sea level. It's an enormous decrease. So there's a couple ways that you can sort of design around this. The first, and this is what the US and France, well, NBDA with Aster also pursued, but what the US has notably pursued with PAC-3 and Talon, the interceptor for THAAD, is the use of an attitude control system, which uses basically a series of attitude control motors, solid or liquid fueled, that fire to orient the missile and maneuver it as needed without the use of control authority from aerodynamic control surfaces. And the great thing about ACS is it works at very well at high altitude, where you won't have much control authority from your fins ACS just works great. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, we were able to increase the engagement ceiling of, say, Pack 3 so much relative to, say, Pack 2. I mean, going from Pack 2, I want to say its engagement ceiling is like 20, 25 kilometers. Pack 3 MSE, it's easily 40 kilometers. And then THAAD is even higher, on the order of like 200 plus kilometers.
Yeah, Pack is a Patriot missile, just so people know.
Yes. Patriot advanced capability, referring to specifically the interceptors fired from Patriot. So that's one way to do it. That's the elegant way, if you will. That's what the US has done. That's what the French inadvertently sort of did with Aster, although that's a whole different rabbit hole that I won't get into. The other way is to just make your aerodynamic control surfaces more effective at higher altitudes, to enable them to give you more control authority. And there's a couple ways you can do that, but the main one, and this is what the Russians did here, going from 9M82 to 77N6, is you just make the missile go faster, because the amount of control authority that you get from aerodynamic control surfaces is in large part a function of airflow over those control surfaces. So if you increase the airspeed of the missile, you increase the airflow, you get more control authority. So the Russians literally made the booster longer on 9M82. They increased its speed. Greater speed, they get greater control authority, and that allows the missile to operate at greater altitudes effectively. And so what they basically did is they took the 30-kilometer engagement ceiling of 9M82, and they roughly, this is an estimate just based upon some numbers from some of the less insane Russian sources, they doubled it to roughly around 60 kilometers. So somewhere just north of Pack 3 MSE, basically. And that accomplished their goal of expanding its defended footprint against TBMs. I don't have a specific number, but I'd guess its defended radius is probably on the order of 60 to 80 kilometers against TBMs, against most classes, certainly the shorter range ones. And so again, somewhere north of Pack 3 MSE, slightly larger again, because its engagement ceiling appears to be a little bit larger. The issue this runs into is it's not a very efficient approach. As you can see, and Germinated to Ukraine, if you want to pull up the that first image I sent you, actually. Yes, thank you. It's a very large missile. It's enormous. So 9M82 and 77N6, as far as I'm aware, shares this diameter. They just made the booster longer. It's not actually any wider. Is 42 inches in diameter. It is, or maximum diameter. It has a lot of taper, as you can see from those diagrams, but its maximum diameter is absolutely comically enormous. And so you have a 42-inch missile that you can put two of on a launcher, or a TEL, transporter erector launcher. And that's just not efficient. That's horrible packing efficiency. So if you want to pull up, I believe, the last image I sent you.
That's this one?
Yes. So just for context, that's THAAD. THAAD can put 8 interceptors, 8 Talons, as they're called, on a single launching station, whereas you get 2 with S-500. And this is a roughly similar form factor, with S-500 being a little bit larger. So, the fact they have chosen to, this is not an elegant term, but to brute force the engineering on this means that they have a missile that, relative to THAAD, we'll do this comparison, you can fit 2 of them on a TEL and get 60-kilometer engagement altitude, 60 to 80 kilometer defended footprint, versus THAAD, where you get 8 interceptors on a launcher, 200-kilometer engagement altitude, and in excess of 200-kilometer defended footprint, because you have that attitude control system. And I'd say probably equally as importantly, and I didn't touch on this in the thread as much as I should have, is it's also hit to kill. So it doesn't have an explosive warhead. It just relies on the kinetic energy that it has from, being accelerated to high speed to impact and destroy a threat. 9M82 and 77N6 by extension, they have to lug around 150 kilogram, or a little over 300-pound warhead of high explosive. So that, in combination with the fact it needs to go abnormally fast to achieve a sufficient level of maneuverability at altitude massively balloons the volume and mass the missile occupies. And to sort of make this comparison a little bit more amusing, again, it's a 42-inch maximum diameter missile for both 9M82 and 77N6. Standard Missile 3, Block 2A, has a diameter of 21 inches. It's a constant diameter, more or less. So what that leaves them with is they have a 42-inch missile that can engage TBMs at 60 kilometers altitude. We have a 21-inch diameter missile that can engage TBMs at 1,000 kilometers. So again, it is the most comically inefficient way I can think of to design an effector meant for theater ballistic missile defense. And the issue this ultimately gives them is, if we compare it, and this sort of ties it back to what relevance does it actually have for Russian missile defense in Crimea. If we tie it back to S-300V, one of the things that S-300V has going for it is, even though it has these massive 42-inch diameter missiles itself, the original 9M82, that's not that much of an issue because most of the battery is loaded with 9M83 ready rounds, which are a lot smaller. You can put 4 of them on the launcher, and the firing unit as a whole has pretty decent magazine depth. We're talking, several dozen rounds. S-500 does not have that. It only has 77N6. There's supposed to be a smaller missile, 40N6M, which is supposed to be a modified version of 40N6 for S-400, but 40N6, the baseline version, is only in fairly limited service. So the smaller missile doesn't exist. So what they're basically left with is a fire unit that likely has 8 to 12 ready rounds. Even if the individual PK is pretty good, again, there's only 8 to 12 of them. And all they have to show for this is, in addition to being able to engage ballistic threats, it can engage aerodynamic or ABTs, air breathing threats, at fairly significant range. So they got that requirement, but they traded basically all of their TBM performance away from it, or away for it. And so this leaves them in a very strange position where the Ukrainians have obviously received quite a few ATACMS from the United States on an ongoing basis. It would be fairly trivial to just exhaust the magazine depth of S-500. I mean, even if the missiles themselves have a 90% probability of kill, it doesn't matter because you only have to salvo, say, 8 to 12 plus 1 ATACMS to defeat a standalone S-500 battery. So from a effect standpoint, it doesn't actually contribute all that much to the Russian defenses in Crimea. The main thing I can think of, and I didn't cover this in the thread, is that I suspect they'll get far more benefit from having S-500's myriad of radars and other sensors that are attached to it, being able to provide data to other air defense systems in Crimea. But the missiles themselves, the actual system, won't be able to contribute that much, if anything, on an engagement basis to defeating Ukrainian strikes into Crimea. So it's a very interesting decision that they've decided to, as it seems, move forward with this deployment, or did so a long time ago, as Budanov sort of implied.
Yeah, great explanation, John. I don't think I personally have any questions. I guess maybe I'll try to sum it up in layman's terms, what I took away from it, right? So Russia wanted a system that could prevent or help them defend better against a ballistic missile threat, right? For dummies, we all know ballistic missiles go up high and then they come back down, right? So in order to defend against it, you need to get up higher. You need to send your missile up higher. That's not necessarily as simple as it sounds because the atmosphere is thinner up there. So you got to figure out a design solution that's maybe a bit smarter or more elegant than just, a normal atmospheric rocket. So what you wind up doing, there's a few ways to do it. There's elegant solutions that some countries have employed. Russia, being Russia, chose to do what they do a lot, which is dumb but a lot. And they created this giganto missile that sort of compromises on a lot of other areas of design, but in theory can do what it needs to do, at least like on paper. But it has this pretty, because of those other compromises, it has pretty severe weaknesses that can probably be easily exploited by a Budanov-shaped man sitting with a frog in a tank in a room, coming up with a plan to do so with enough ATACMS missiles, right? So I don't know, John, is there like, and I think you summed up pretty well like what it means to be for the unit to be in Crimea. Yeah, is there anything you would maybe correct about my takeaways?
I mean, that's pretty, that's pretty spot on. The only thing I would add is I think, I've had some ongoing discussions with Granger and others about this. Is I think S-500 more than anything is the result of an insane political procurement process that's just dysfunctional and filled with graft, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning. The initial indications were that the VKS wanted something optimized for air breathing threats. They got something at the end. They got something that's optimized for ballistic threats, but horrifically so. So there's almost certainly some insane Russian internal procurement politics that resulted in this just abomination existing.
Yeah, so I guess like thanks for the very comprehensive explanation of S-500, John. I was certainly very confused going into this, so I think you cleared up a lot of things for me. It's like, I think the main thing is like all of these systems are different. Just there is no such thing really as S-300. There are 3 different ones, and then like all of these other systems aren't necessarily straight upgrades. They have specialized roles, right? So this S-500 has a very specific anti-ballistic missile kind of job, right?
Yes. And it doesn't help. I mean, the Russians have always been bad about, releasing BS claims about the performance of their systems, but S-500 has been a particularly egregious example. And so there's just a lot. The signal to noise ratio out there when it comes to information about it is just extremely poor. My favorite is that they claim it can intercept hypersonic reentry vehicles, or hypersonic glide vehicles, I guess, at 180 to 200 kilometer altitude. And it's like, no, it can't. It doesn't have an attitude control system. There is no way that I don't care how fast the missile is going, unless it's going a fraction of the speed of light, it is not going to have any control, any aerodynamic control authority at those altitudes.
So Mark, good. Do we have any questions from chat about
Yes.
S-500? Go ahead.
Yes, we have 2 questions. So just quick question, John. Do you or are you be later on also for the Q&A, the general one, or because we have one, as far as I can tell, one F-16 question, and when you wouldn't be on later, I would show it now if it's fine for you.
Yeah,
But when you're
do we want to do S-500 questions right now or later?
yeah, of course. I just want to ask you if you're still there later.
Yeah, sure.
Sneak in anything you want, Maurice.
Okay,
John
let's start with let's start with the S-500 questions. So we have one question from Thierry. Question for John: would be a ballistic missile not be more efficient if it returned to Earth path? It could accelerate to defeat the interceptors.
Oh Lord! So this is a thing. The Iranians have advertised missiles with this capability, Fatah 2. I think either Fatah 1 or Fatah 2. The Marv has has a propulsion system on board. So it's a thing that certain countries have looked at. There's pros and cons to it. The issue that you run into is that stuff like that works against a relatively unsophisticated adversary. It works less well against a sophisticated one. So I'll just use the Iranian one as an example because it's the only one that's actually reached production or is going to, that I'm aware of. You can do, you aren't going to be doing that propulsive stuff in deep terminal when you're when you're in the lower atmosphere and the atmosphere is fairly dense. You're not going to be doing propulsive maneuvers because it's more efficient to use aerodynamic maneuvering at those denser altitudes. And that's one of the things I should say explicitly about ACS is that ACS is great, but it really works well when the atmosphere is fairly thin. You don't get that much control authority from it, all things considered. You get a decent bit, but not nearly as much as you can if you're doing it in very dense atmosphere. So, you can try and do impulsive maneuvers when you're entering terminal, when the atmosphere is very thin, or in mid-course even. And that, potentially works against unsophisticated adversaries. When you're dealing with, say, the US, it's a bit different because we have layered defenses. We have THAAD and we have Patriot. The issue with a lot of these schemes is that if you start doing funky propulsive stuff to energy defeat THAAD, you're going to basically lose your ability to energy defeat Patriot and vice versa. It's a very hard problem to solve once you actually start dealing with an adversary that has multi-tier defenses. So again, to more directly answer the question, yes, that's something in a similar form that other countries have looked at. It's not something that's widely caught on, though, as far as I'm aware. I'm only aware of this single Iranian example. There may have been stuff that the U.S. worked on way back when that did that never left the test phase. Same thing for the Soviets, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Terry, for asking and John for explaining. We have another question from Necton. If the high altitude maneuverability is achieved purely from control surfaces, would it not be possible to outmaneuver it quite easily with an attitude control system on ballistic missiles?
Oh, so this is the fun part. So this is something I didn't touch on in the thread. Well, I did very briefly with one word. So I said THAAD had better in-game capability than 7.7N6 or better in-game maneuverability specifically. And what I mean is that you don't even have to have an attitude control system, attitude control motors on your TBM to maneuver defeat an interceptor that's only using aerodynamic control surfaces. So again, like I said, it's all dependent. Well, it's largely dependent on airspeed and airflow over those control surfaces. So if you have a MARV, maneuvering reentry vehicle, for example, that thing has usually four fairly stubby and small control surfaces. That MARV, though, is usually traveling a hell of a lot faster than the interceptor that's coming up to get it. And so because of that, it's going to have quite a bit of control, quite a bit more control authority, all else being equal, than the interceptor that's coming up to defeat it if that interceptor just has aerodynamic control surfaces. So it's very conceivable that a MARV could maneuver defeat more or less something like 7.7N6 or 9M82 or 9M83. You can add ACS onto your ballistic missile too if you want extra margin there, but it isn't strictly necessary. The flip side, though, is once you're dealing with something like a PAC-3 or THAAD that has ACS, that becomes a lot more challenging because those are specifically part of the reason they have that capability beyond being able to maneuver at high altitude to begin with is because ACS enables them to be extremely nimble and intercept maneuvering ballistic threats in particular. And we've qualified both THAAD and PAC-3 against highly maneuverable MARV targets or threat simulators on the range.
Okay, thank you for the question and for answering. Then we have a question regarding the F-16s, and I believe maybe Joseph can also talk about it because I remember him talking on the news about something like this. I hope I remember it. A question from Genix, I hope. Is Ukraine anywhere near being able to protect F-16s on its own airfields?
I guess maybe I'll just jump in. I think I'm more setting this up for John than anything, but I would guess that that's been the primary concern of air forces that have been trying to help Ukraine and the Ukrainian Air Force in terms of integrating F-16. The MiGs I know have some capabilities to. I'll put it this way: the Soviets assumed that the US and their allies would be able to, in the Cold War, strike their airfields pretty much with impunity. And so they didn't really count on their airfields being very operable or like invulnerable. I would say maybe to the degree that the West did. And as a result, the MiG is designed to maybe handle a bit more rugged takeoff and landing conditions than Western airframes. We have documented examples of MiG aircraft like taking off on roads in Ukraine. They're known to be able to, in theory, they have like on the intakes, they have covers so that they can take off in a dirt field so that the dirt doesn't get into the intake. So, I couldn't speak to the specifics of like how well it actually is at this job, but I do know it was designed with this in mind. And so I think that I assume since F-16s have been on the table, the Ukrainians have been scrambling to, I assume, probably either dig new hardened air bunker facilities to put the F-16s in, or maybe revive some old Soviet facilities. I think that up until now, they've probably basically been playing a shell game with their MiGs, a very brilliant one, where they've managed to keep their Air Force operable in very difficult conditions. I mean, again, it was assumed that the Russian Air Force would just wax these guys, right? And they've stayed in the fight for years. But I assume now a different game will need to be played where the facilities are hardened and protected versus being able to just move them around as much. So, John, I'm curious what you think about all that.
So yes and no. There's a fair bit of nuance here. So the F-16s in and of themselves won't necessarily be that much more difficult to defend than the MiG-29s or the Su-27s, the Fulcrums and the flankers, just fundamentally. There's, there is some difference that comes from the Fulcrums and the flankers being somewhat more optimized for dispersed operations than the F-16s. The main ones, the main things that come to mind are both Fulcrum and flanker have more heavily reinforced tires, particularly the nose gear, and they also have those intake covers. And just because I have to correct you on this, Joseph, it's not to allow them to take off from dirt surfaces. They can only take off and land on paved surfaces. What that means is that you don't have to do a FOD walk, a foreign object debris. You don't have to go out and sweep the whatever surface you're using for takeoff and landing. You don't have to go out and sweep that of FOD. And so it just reduces the risk of FOD being ingested in the intakes and shredding the engines. So it just makes you don't have to have that to do dispersed operations. You can land and you can take off and land in an F-16 on a runway. It's a bit more of a pain in the ass in terms of the amount of effort you have to put in to make that work. So a lot of it really comes down to the Russians, to be honest. How much focus do they want to put on targeting the F-16s with their standoff capabilities? If their current tempo of raids and targeting practices remain the same, I'd say Ukraine should have a fairly straightforward time keeping its F-16s operable. If the Russians want to focus down an airbase, so to speak, there isn't that much the Ukrainians can do about it, just because they don't have enough air defense assets. If they really want to, they could relocate a Patriot fire unit to cover a specific airbase they feel is worthy of a high level of protection. But otherwise, if the Russians want to, dump 100 cruise missiles onto a specific airbase combined with ballistic missiles, Shaheds, they can do that, and a fair fraction of them will probably get through. Obviously, whether or not they hit anything or cause any damage, open question. What I would say about hardening the airfields is there are some airfields in Ukraine that have HAAS, hardened aircraft shelters. There's some that don't. For example, the peacetime primary airfield for 40th Tactical Aviation Squadron around Kyiv, specifically their primary airbase at Kyiv, if memory serves. They have hardened aircraft shelters. There's other tactical aviation units at other air bases that don't, but they're an example of one that does. Hardened aircraft shelters are great against a couple things. They're great if your enemy is using submunitions. As rather amusingly, the Russians have now deployed a KH-101 with submunitions, and one of the first targets they employed it against was the HAAS at Kyiv, which are rated to defeat submunitions. So good on them for that. That was very amusing. The other thing that a Haas gets you is protection from close impacts. And I think this is something that's often overlooked. A hardened aircraft shelter is not going to protect you from a direct impact from 1,000-kilogram precision guided munition. It is going to go clean through the roof of your shelter, and it is going to destroy the aircraft inside. What Haas lets you do is, they force your enemy to allocate one PGM, or to allocate at least one aim point per hardened aircraft shelter. So it makes their job more difficult, but it doesn't make it impossible. So it prevents them from taking a cruise missile with a cluster munition dispenser and just having it fly over 10 revetments and wipe out 10 aircraft. It means they have to allocate, one cruise missile or one ballistic missile per individual shelter.
Yeah, we just saw that in the Russian case, right? This Su-57, where one got destroyed, it looks like, or heavily damaged, and one got lightly damaged in one hit, right? Like,
well, they landed a couple UAVs on that one. I wouldn't use the UAVs as an example because the Ukrainian UAVs have a very small payload, so they're sort of an exception to the rule.
True, but I guess what I'm saying is, like, Russia didn't have any kind of hardening in that facility,
Correct.
right?
I mean, just to go on this tangent for a moment, the Russians could have defeated those UAVs without a hardened shelter. They could have just had a shelter that's not very hardened, and it would have defeated the UAV because they have tiny payloads. But again, they're skinned, they're cheap, like always, and they learn. They don't learn very obvious things until they go through an extreme amount of pain. But in any case,
I understand. I think I had a more generic understanding as like hardening as a concept of just like protecting. I think you maybe have a more specific. So could you define hardening real quick? It just means like concrete or what?
I mean, there's many ways you can approach it. Concrete's the usual approach, yes, for aircraft shelters.
Sorry.
No, I was going to round this out by saying, a lot depends on, the precision of Russian PGMs and the amount of time they spend mensurating these targets, doing the TLE, the target location error analysis, to get direct hits. If the Russians, if the Russians can get a direct hit on one of these shelters, it won't matter. The question is whether or not they're, going to be able to do that, and that's sort of an open question. I just wanted to mention that in regard to what Joseph said to hardening.
Okay. Yeah, real quick, I'll be the first to say, listen to John over me. Like I'm telling that to the audience. Like don't listen to me, listen to John. All right, go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask John and also Joseph, you. I heard very recently, a couple of days ago, that and I don't know if it's true. You need to correct me if that's not true. That the F-16s will be stationed outside of Ukraine, and when they are needed to whatever they're going to do, they fly into Ukraine, be armored there, and then fly to the combat mission. Is that does anybody heard that or know for a fact that it's not true? Because that's very related, in my opinion, to the question, because when they are just flying to Ukraine to be armored, they are like, how much time does it take? Half an hour? And then they are flying outside the country again. They would be very safe on airfields outside of Ukraine.
Yeah, so maybe we'll go with Joe's dumb take and then John's smart take again. It sounds to me like I haven't heard anything about this personally. It sounds to me like it would be too cumbersome to do that in actual operations, like air operations. You need the aircrafts to be sitting around. You're working on them when they're not flying. Like it requires a lot of maintenance to keep these things operating. So yeah, I would assume it would be an overly elaborate production to have them constantly cycling in and out of the country versus keeping them fixed in place to work on them. John?
You could make it work for taskings that aren't time sensitive. So, what you could do is a hot pit. So basically you have a Ukrainian F-16 sortie from an airbase in Poland, touchdown, airbase in Western Ukraine. They top up the fuel, they load up the munitions, they take off again. They do it literally, on the runway or the taxiway, then it's gone, and then it goes, executes its tasking, returns. either making a pit stop back in Ukraine on its way back to Poland or just flies directly there, depending on what the fuel load looks like. That's one way to do it. That won't work if you need quick response, so there's limitations, but in principle, you can make it work. Obviously, the airframes are safer outside of Ukraine, and they'll probably get better sustainment and maintenance outside Ukraine simply because it's going to take Ukrainian ground crews and maintainers and sustainers a fair bit of time to get truly proficient on maintaining this platform. There's pros and cons. In other words, it'll make sense in some situations. Potentially, it won't make sense in others.
Yeah, if they need like long-term repair, I could see that. Like they have to sit in place for a while. Like John said, it makes a lot of sense to just have it not happen in Ukraine. It reduces a lot of risk.
Okay, then just to stay a little bit on the F-16 topic because we have more questions for that. I believe it's one more question regarding F-16s. From Janet, any idea why some F-16s countries want Sweden to wait with the Gripen, and why can France send Mirage?
It's a great question. Why the double standard? Sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, so the French don't listen to us. That's the first thing to consider. I mean, I don't know why the French sent Mirage, to be honest. I mean, I don't. The Ukraine benefits less from Mirage than they would have if France had just put down a bunch of money to help support the F-16s. The Mirages won't be useless, far from that, but it's going to be they're going to be a bit of an orphan child in the Ukrainian Air Force going forward. So I suspect this was just politics. I mean, the French wanting to buck the U.S. for their own reasons. Also, this is a subsidy for Dassault because they must always have their cut, such as the way of the universe. And yeah, I mean, again, Ukraine would have been better served if the French had dropped 5 billion euros on upgrading the F-16s to, get actual decent radars, for example. But that just isn't how it shook out, unfortunately.
Good. Okay, we have another question from Thierry. What you propose about F-16 stored in other countries could also be considered as that host country be, I'm not trying to pronounce that English word.
Co-belligerent.
Thank you.
So my take is that it's irrelevant. The specifics of the international law in this case or in law of armed conflict in IHL are irrelevant because we have a nuclear deterrent and the Russians aren't going to attack us simply because we meet some formal definition of being co-belligerents. I mean, that's the reality at the end of the day. We have a nuclear deterrent. The Russian, even if this somehow does make us legal combatants, the Russians aren't going to do anything because we have an overwhelming conventional and nuclear deterrent. So the practicalities went out over the formalities in the end.
Yeah, in practical terms, I agree with John. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I encourage them to try. I encourage them. Please make my day.
Joseph, did you want to say something else, or?
No, that's pretty much it. Just I guess I could understand why there might be some dancing around this, just because for the reasons John laid out, like international law and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, I think, as John said, in practical terms, if this needs to be done, it'll probably happen.
Yeah, and I was about to be honest. I was about to say, like, okay, I'm doing the Olaf Scholz now. Does it make us participants in the war when we are stationing them outside of Ukraine? But I just want to highlight and bring to your attention that when Ukraine, and I'm sure that's not only in Germany the case, when Ukraine is training on let's say, for example, new Leopard tanks or Armadas, whatever, they are already owning them. So they are basically training with their own tanks and their own infantry fighting vehicles on German training grounds. And then they will be delivered to Ukraine. And the same goes, for example, for when it's about regular maintenance, when the F-16s would get maintenance by Western partners. That also goes for the Leopard maintenance hubs, for example, in Lithuania and Poland right now, or now, of course, in Ukraine, but prior in Lithuania and Poland. I mean, that's German personnel or Lithuanian personnel or Polish personnel working on Ukrainian tanks outside of Ukraine. So I don't think that would be such a different outcome or situation, or anybody else in a different opinion on that, Joseph, John?
Well,
Yeah,
what
well,
I would give an example on the other side of things. Belarus is a combatant in this war. They are a legal party to this war. Ukraine has not targeted anything in Belarus, despite the fact they are, from an international law perspective, at war with each other. The Belarusians like to act like it, and the Ukrainian government has kind of tiptoed around the issue. But from all accepted international legal standards, Belarus and Ukraine are in a state of war as well. And again, nothing has sort of come from it in terms of direct consequences inflicted by Ukraine inside of Belarus beyond, Belarusian opposition, hitting an A-50 with UAVs. So it's very similar to that, in that the Russians aren't going to do anything about it because their practicality triumphs over formality in the end.
Yeah, like as Nectorn said in chat, right? I mean, we have sort of a precedent for this with the MiGs, where MiGs were sent to Ukraine, but rather than like just fly them over there and be like, here you go, and hand them the keys, we had to do this rigmarole where we like disassembled them and put them in trains and sent them over and all that. Like,
no, some of them flew directly over. The Slovakian ones that were airworthy flew directly to Ukraine.
okay, this is later though, right?
The ones that were disassembled weren't airworthy. They were used as parts donors. The airworthy ones were just flown directly to Ukraine, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, well, if that's the case, then we already have a precedent where it's probably fine to be doing stuff like that, right?
Yeah. The other precedent was at the beginning, I think in February, a Ukrainian MiG fled into Romanian airspace and landed at a Romanian airfield, and we disarmed the MiG before we let the pilot return to Ukraine. Then I assume we shipped the munitions back to them as well, but we disarmed the MiG before letting them return to Ukraine.
How polite.
And just to add up with the disassembled mix, and I don't want to offend on any Poles here, so don't take it as an offense, but this is also a Polish legend that Poland back in early 2022 already, where they are not officially delivered any MiG fighter jets, that they have disassembled MiG fighter jets and delivered them disassembled to Ukraine, and just said that they have delivered spare parts. So yeah, just as an addendum to your what you said.
Yeah, I guess like as John said, I think the facts might be a bit murkier, like what we can confirm about that or not. But I think like what I'm saying is like in practice, right? Does it really what principle of international law is being upheld, whether we just fly these things over the border versus like what if we did disassemble them and put them in a train and send them over and reassemble them? Would we suddenly be upholding international law then, right? So at the end of the day, it seems like a kind of meaningless or silly distinction. We should just do it, I think, is what I'm kind of getting at with that, right?
Yeah, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, but I think as John pointed out, we already have a much better precedent, so we don't even need to go there, which is they've already flown MiGs just straight in. So, I don't see why F-16s are any different.
Listen, if Macedonia can fly their Su-25s directly to Ukraine.
Okay, so we have two last questions on F-16s. Both are very similar, so I'll read them together. Kellen asks, do we have confirmed details about the types of radars on the actual F-16s that Ukraine will receive? Are they all being upgraded? And the second question by Thierry, will at least some F-16s get better radars?
That's a John
question.
That's the John question, absolutely.
There's no substantive information that the F-16s are getting radar upgrades. I have not seen anything compelling to that effect. I mean, hopefully they do, but there's just no information to indicate that they are. That's that has substance to it, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, that was a fast answer. I will go to Patriot stuff, and then we had one question at the very, very beginning about the links when I did my segment, so that's a long-awaited question. That's probably also for John, not only for me. For Gao, I may have missed this earlier, but is Germany also considering sending a fourth Patriot system to Ukraine? Are all German Patriots Pack 2? Do we know if the second US Patriot is a Pack 3? So first, to begin at the end, the US one isn't officially pledged yet, as far as I know. And for the German one, considering I talked to John about this earlier, and at the beginning, when we pledged our third battery to Ukraine, the German Ministry of Defense already said in their press release that they are going to send additional Patriot batteries later on during the war. So we already knew it back in April when they announced the third one that it's not going to be Germany's last one, which is very great news. So this is going to happen. The question is, for me, is when it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen. So, and second one are all German Patriot Pack 2s. At least the systems or the batteries, or to make John proud, the fire units we had delivered to Ukraine are all in the Pack 2 configuration, because the German ones are getting upgrades right now.
Okay, I have to interrupt you here. So
You have to interrupt me, okay.
yes. So I've gone over this in painful detail with Moritz. All the German fire units, Patriot fire units, can employ Pack 3. Germany has not provided Pack 3 rounds, but the individual fire units themselves, they have either M902 or M903 launchers or launching stations. They are physically compatible with Pack 3 CRI at a minimum. I'm not sure if all of them have been upgraded to M903, which supports Pack 3 MSE, but all of them at a minimum can use Pack 3 or Pack 3 CRI. They also have MPQ-65 radar stations, so they have the traveling wave tube and everything else needed to support a Pack 3 engagement. Their current upgrades are just to get all of the German Patriot fire units to PDB 8.1, so post-deployment build 8.1, which is a mix of software and hardware upgrades. But the overall German fire units, as is, can employ US provided Pack 3 rounds.
Okay, that's news to me, but I'm going to believe you.
Well, so what Moritz, to quote Moritz directly, is he was pointing out that there have been German units deployed with Pack 3 for the past decade, and that they've all been upgraded, at least to the basic level of capability needed to employ Pack 3.
Okay. Hope that answers the question. And
I hope Moritz is right. I know who he works for, so I'm very strongly inclined to believe him. He could, of course, be wrong, but that's my understanding from him. And given who his employer is, I consider him the subject matter expert here.
well, yeah, I'm not saying you or him is wrong. It's just completely news for me, because from my understanding is that the German, and of course I might be wrong here, as you pointed out, that the German batteries are going upgrades right now to be Pack 3 compatible, and when we get another battery out from the industry, which had upgrades being done right now, then we are sending an older one to Ukraine. It's absolutely correct that we have just delivered Pack 2 missiles to Ukraine, but it is completely news to me, and it doesn't have to be wrong because of that. That everything is Pack 3 compatible, which is of course great news.
Yes, so the German fire units are getting upgrades, but the specific upgrade is to PDB 8.1, post-deployment build 8.1. You don't need PDB 8.1 to employ Pack 3. You can do it with older versions of the software build. So the thing that I'm unclear on is whether or not all German fire units have been upgraded to M903 launching stations. If they can all employ Pack 3 MSE, or if it's just Pack 3 or Pack 3 CRI. That's the bit I'm unclear on.
Okay, that's very interesting. I will spend a couple of hours researching after the stream.
Real quick, Maurice.
Yeah.
I want to shoot this to John real quick, and maybe you also. I want to clarify. So we had some like rumors that SAMP-T system would be donated by Italy, and then like there were some denials. But then there were like some unofficial confirmations, and then as far as I understand, this week there were some official denials. So I think
I
where
have
we're
Was
at
it?
is no SAMT. Is that correct? No SAMT is where we landed, or no?
I thought the Italian foreign minister said it's going to happen.
So what what Erland pointed out in some of our internal discussions is that the Italian foreign minister has repeatedly pledged things that were never actually delivered to Ukraine. So him publicly saying that Ukraine will receive something doesn't actually mean anything.
Oh. Good.
And also, as far as I know, like I don't know. I was just looking through the news. I was doing my news report. I saw something about like they said no, like the Italian government said there won't be one coming, like something to that effect. But maybe I'll look real quick. But anyway, just want to get any kind of clarification on that we could. So we're gonna say maybe right now. I think we're still in the maybe category with the Italian SAMT. Is that fair?
Well, it's, for me personally, it's just very interesting to hear that it's, when the Italian foreign minister actually says something that doesn't mean anything. That's just, it shocks me a little bit right now.
Well, it means in that moment he was very passionate about Ukrainian air defense.
Yeah, I mean, it really just goes under my skin, because when you see what, in terms of air defense, let's just talk about air defense. So much more is needed. And Ukraine is asking for 7 additional Patriot batteries. We have one which is 100% coming from Germany. We have another one which the Netherlands are trying to assemble from different donor countries. We have the US, which is not really interested in giving one, but maybe it is. Who knows? No official confirmation yet. We have friends who are saying, no, we need our SAMTs right now for the Olympic Games and other stuff. Ukraine is getting them later. And now the Italy stuff, which was confirmed to me, is also be like, yeah, maybe not. Who knows? It's like, I don't know. In Germany, I would say alle drehen Däumchen. It's yeah, very, very weird to understand for me, in my opinion. Sorry for the rant.
Yeah, I don't know. But so I think we're waiting for some as far as I know, like again, I'm not super up to date on this specific issue, but as far as I understand, we're maybe waiting for Italian G7. Like I saw a bunch of aid packages from everyone else that resulted from the G7. I haven't seen anything specific from Italy, but I'm reading like right now that there's like they're going to have a military aid package. So we might see an announcement from Italy. The G7 is happening in Italy right now, as far as I understand. So we might see an announcement from Italy of a defense package for Ukraine. When that comes, when we see that announcement, people should look for the SAMT, whether it's there or not, I think. And if it's not there, the answer is probably that was just all hot air. If it is there, it's confirmed. I think that would be maybe my hot take. So anyway, that's sorry to go down that rabbit hole of whether or not it got sent.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay, then we have to answer the very, very first question from Nocturne. Does anybody have an idea what advantages, disadvantages links have compared to other IFVs? As far as I understood, they only ever won a contract in Hungary. So I'm not the expert on infantry fighting vehicles, especially the Lynx. Just want to highlight that the only one contract, yes, that's Hungary. But as far as if I recall correctly, John, please correct me. Okay, he's gone. Perfect timing. The US is currently like having a look at it because they want a replacement for Bradley's. Joseph, maybe you know about it. It's like a contract 40-50 billion euros worth.
For what, sir?
For the successor of the Bradley.
Yes, yeah. The U.S. is currently working on a new infantry fighting vehicle. They've spent a ton of money on it, I'm sure. I couldn't tell you more than that, though.
Yeah, so when I recall correctly, the Lynx is also being investigated by the US. Maybe they already denied it, but my last info is that it's still in like being investigated. And
Yeah, it makes
in
sense.
terms,
Like when we're looking for a new piece of equipment like that, we basically have trials, and different companies will submit different designs and stuff. And like it'd be very understandable for them to just have this in the running still. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no, it's fine. And in terms of advantages and disadvantages, as you pointed out, it has just won a contract for Hungary. I believe the first ever built vehicle was delivered a couple of weeks ago or so. So there's no real battle proof or combat experience where one could say, hey, in terms of the real world, this is better, this is less good, and I actually can't give you an answer to that. Because for most modern IFVs like the CV90, for example, they have real world experience, and for the Lynx, everything is just theoretical.
I would argue that the mismanagement of the Orban regime could be compared to some kind of field service, but I don't know what exactly.
Yeah, maybe. So yeah, we will have to see when the first Lynx IVs will be supplied to Ukraine, and I think it will definitely be happening because, as I pointed out in the longer tweet I made a couple of hours ago, out of the 140, I believe it's 140 MADA IVs that Germany has pledged since January 2023, only 20 are still on the list. They are going refurbishment and overhaul right now, and afterwards are being upgraded and then sent to Ukraine. Everything will be done in the next 2 months, about 2-3 months. And afterwards, Germany won't have pledged any IVs, at least from the current state. So wouldn't surprise me if we are then announcing 50, 100, maybe 200 Lynx IVs to be delivered and produced for Ukraine. Given the recent announcements, the signing of the memorandum of understanding between Rheinmetall and the UDI, the Ukrainian defense industry. Yeah, I think these are very strong signals and signs, and yeah, we'll have to see. And yeah, I believe that's all the questions we had. Let me just take a look at the end. Oh, there's one more question. Also from Kellen. Is it confirmed that NATO will now administer the Rammstein meetings / weapons logistics to Ukraine instead of the US in light of possible Trump return? I believe that's correct, right, Joseph?
I believe that's correct. I'm not sure. Like, I always have trouble in these types of things understanding what is official, like what is an official thing that's happening versus like they talked about it, right? So for sure they have discussed this, and that seems to be the plan, as it were. But I'm not sure like officially a framework has been established to actually make this happen. But I mean, I think we're at the level where this is going to be. It's going to probably be happening this way. I think that's correct. And I mean, honestly, it's probably better this way, right? Like, yeah, it should be organized that way, in my opinion, in the first place.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, that's actually happening, or that's actually happened. I believe I read it in the German news, like yesterday or so. So yeah.
Good.